As Knife Party, Rob Swire and Gareth McGrillen have written some of the most memorable and impactful bass music of all time. From Internet Friends to Centipede, Haunted House to Antidote, and the collections some of these tracks make up, their mark has certainly been left on the modern EDM landscape, so much so they're recognised far beyond the electronic sphere. But is it in fact their debut album Abandoned Ship that stands as their most impressive release thus far? By dipping into the LP format, did Swire and McGrillen achieve a new level of excellence they perhaps hadn't with their other material released both post and prior? This notion and more is what I'm going to be arguing in my exploration of this 56.5-minute genre-spanning LP. I'll be setting up the album's release with some context before exploring the project itself and how Swire and McGrillen shifted their practice of perfectionism in a very significant way. With this video, I hope to show how Knife Party achieved everything with this record, even if most of the music itself isn't the best they've created or put out. I hope to lay bare its scope, ambition, and purpose and how it constitutes as the most complete representation of everything Knife Party is about, to illustrate why the Abandoned Ship LP is indeed perfect. The lead up to Abandoned Ship's release is important in fully realising the excellence of it. Up to mid-2013, Swire and McGrillen had branched out from Pendulum to establish themselves as one of the go-to acts for super high-octane electro and modern dubstep, and every fusion that came with that, or seizure music as they like to call it. But it was equally about the way it was produced and crafted to go with the energy of it that garnered Swire and McGrillen their mass following. Seizure music would suggest something chaotic and mind-melting to the point of being disorderly and difficult to keep up with. But the reality was that every single release in their earliest years struck that perfect balance between completely maxed out and over the top to be almost comical, whilst also having an exceptional polish to the execution that you could hardly find anywhere else at the time. And near every track of theirs, if not every one, prior to Abandoned Ship was exceptional, both originals and remixes. There were huge hits with more global appeal like Internet Friends, Bonfire and Centipede, all of which had top 100 chart placements in both the US and UK, which is quite rare for a bass-filled dark electronic music cut. There was also a plethora of fan favourites which differed wildly from person to person. Destroy Them with Lasers, Firehive, Rage Valley, Sleaze, Power Glove, LRAD, remixes of Save the World, Crush on You, Unison, Last Time, I could go on and on. Knife Party was all about going more overboard and wild than anyone else ever had before in bass music, whilst executing it all in the most considered and measured way, a mark they hit over and over, time and time again. Swire mentioned to Billboard in 2019 how if all their aforementioned hits were even slightly different, or had different synths or drums, they'd have been the worst songs ever. Whilst there may be a touch of exaggeration at play there from Swire, this details exactly the intentional perfectionism from him and McGrillen to sell exactly what Knife Party is about. Yes, the aim was to meld house structures and dubstep sounds and branch out into every other bass genre one can think of whilst making the ideas as thrilling as possible, but it's just as much, if not more, the aim to give that madness the best foundation possible by producing the music as meticulously and carefully as one can. The game-changing singles, remixes and EPs had captivated the bass scene, but there was one yet to be explored format that lay in wait for Swire and McGrillen. The one format every bass fan had been desperate to see them try their hand at, and which was the perfect next step for them to take given what they'd released and achieved up to that point. The rampant calls for a debut Knife Party album came calling, and they were answered. Actually, before we get going on the album itself, maybe just a bit more context to really set this project up. After months of anticipation from the middle of 2014, Abandoned Ship was scheduled to release November 24th across their own label, Earstorm Records, as well as Big B and Warner Brothers. This was already following a significant delay from the first release date at the end of October, but to the simultaneous delight and surprise of fans, the album ended up going back on its rescheduled date to drop at the beginning of November. It's understood that iTunes leaked the collection accidentally a few weeks early, but some have speculated as to whether Swire and McGrillen did this purposefully to create even more hype and excitement for the album's drop. Regardless, the premature release had fans leaping out their seats as the final piece of the Knife Party jigsaw was unveiled to the world. Indeed though, what about the music itself? As previously discussed, prior to Abandoned Ship, Knife Party had been entirely about evil, mind-melting bass music of all kinds with a relentless energy almost start to finish in every track and EP. But with this debut full-length LP, whilst it was clear Swire and McGrillen wanted to maintain that core Knife Party essence, they also wanted to branch out significantly, and perhaps most importantly, re-engage with even deeper roots of theirs along the way. It kicks off with the fantastic opening couplet of Reconnect and Resistance. The former harks back to the introduction of their first ever live set in Ibiza in 2011, exuding the same impending feeling that something huge is about to happen. The music is grand and heroic. You feel like you're on Swire and McGrillen's ship, which has just taken off and is about to voyage through the album. The lyrics give it even more of an epic feel, mentioning how with every shipwreck comes the chance to begin again, that out of death comes life. It's clear from the off that with this project they're closing one door and opening another, reconnecting with Knife Party whilst also unleashing new life in it altogether.
For every shipwreck comes the chance to begin again.
Resistance following that is Knife Party in full electro flow, as manic, dizzying and off the wall as they've ever been. Sampling what seems to be a Simpsons imitation of Australian actor Paul Hogan before each drop, this track is regarded by many as a successor to their 2011 cut Destroy Them With Lasers.
You call that a knife? This is a knife.
It's here that the journey to C really feels like it's begun. The pacing of it through its introduction, builds, drops, midsection and outro is incredible. And coupled with Reconnect, it would work perfectly as music for an opening fight sequence to any action-packed film.
This is a knife.
On the heaviness front, the highlights continue to flood in across the album following that blistering introduction. Boss Mode can undeniably get flat at points, but does inject some mysterious Middle Eastern dubstep trap hybrid flavour into the mix. 404 carries on the exhilarating, unforgiving electro flavour of the album with more expert sampling on show. Give It Up presents itself as Bonfire 2.0 with a lot of the synth patterns in the drops being very similar. The reggae-leaning vocal is another clear similarity between the two. Some even think the pre-drop sample says Bon from Bonfire just before saying Give It Up, but whether Swire and McGrillen would bait themselves out like that, I'm not so sure. In the second half of the LP, there's the infamous Micro Penis, a track framed around the idea of someone waking up to one day discover the horror of having, yeah, you guessed it, extremely small genitalia. The primal festival-driven heaviness is difficult not to move along with, and it shows Swire and McGrillen at perhaps their most shocking and comedic, which, as we all know, is saying something. Also dropping in an 8-bit chiptune midsection about using your little power to conquer the world and save the princess feels particularly inspired, even for Knife Party. It's a hilarious and stimulating cut, all in all. The Devilish Red Dawn carries on in that big room vein with more enchanting musicality and powerful instrumentation to boot. Kaleidoscope follows that to close Abandoned Ship and is to me the most underrated track on the LP considering the relative lack of fanfare for it and the amount of depth it provides. There's a really deep emotion to this tune in tying up the album, rounding off that sense of story to elevate the LP beyond being solely a collection of bangers. The mid-tempo leaning beat motors along whilst melodically it's hopeful and empowering. However, there is an uncertainty to this curtain closer that initially left Knife Party as a project overall somewhat in the balance. Online, the lyrics are reported as saying, "Let me save you, it's the last party on earth," but I have to say that's never what I've heard. To me, it sounds more like, what do you say? Is it the last party ever? They're similar of course, but the latter has a distinct remorse and sadness to it that isn't captured in the first take. Listening to this album for the first time in November 2014 and hearing someone in the final track effectively say, "Is this the last Knife Party we're ever gonna get?" definitely gets you thinking. Of course, as we all know, they have put out music since, but to hear that without knowing they'd release again made Kaleidoscope feel not just like a closing of Abandoned Ship, but Knife Party altogether. Many even believe, perhaps cheekily, that this was the last true Knife Party project we got, considering the relative nosedive the duo went down in quality following Abandoned Ship. But who knows, maybe it was their plan to quit at that point. It certainly gives the track and album and Knife Party overall more stature. There's also the experimentation on Abandoned Ship, and if there's any song on it that perfectly captures the shift into a new approach for Knife Party, it's EDM Trend Machine. From the title, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was a VIP or continuation of their 2013 cut EDM Death Machine, but when you hear them, it's clear the tracks are similar only in name. EDM Trend Machine is a smorgasbord of electronic sound, jumping from tropical leaning house to deep house with elements of big room and electro splintered in as well. The lyrics I've always found interesting, saying as long as we fight it together we can turn it around, which I've always tried to glean some kind of meaning from but never quite been able to. If you've got any thoughts on those lyrics in particular, I'd love to know what you think in the comments down below. Track 5, Begin Again, holds a particularly special place on Abandoned Ship, and also within the Knife Party discography overall, as the first track of theirs featuring a full vocal from Swire. Many find this to be a stagnant point on the LP, but I love it as an outpouring of vulnerable emotion and tying together of the heavier parts on the collection. The relationship between all the different sections is spot on and it progresses beautifully. There's a very pure and genuine feel radiating off it from start to finish. Devils in My Heart backs up that euphoria later on in the album, albeit in a more fist-pumping, club-driven way. While simple, with the combination of pounding Ibiza house beat and snappy vocal snippet, I find this to be one of the most infectious cuts on the album. There's also Superstar, generally one of the least enjoyed cuts on the LP, and perhaps the clearest diversion from what Knife Party is usually about. This is thrown straight back in the face of those detractors, as a demented voice mumbles,
"Oh my god, what the fuck is this disco shit? What happened to the dubstep?"
It's Swire and McGrillen in full meta mode poking fun at those expecting them to do the same thing over and over, hence the title Abandoned Ship. The jazzy vocal from I See Monsters matches the beaming, triumphant instrumental perfectly, and whilst conceptually it doesn't feel as inspired as others on the album, it's tracks like this one, Devil's in My Heart and Begin Again that are essential between the heavier stuff to provide relief and make it listenable front to back. I personally like all the tracks to varying degrees and don't find any of them notably weak, but talking strictly about the musical ideas, I certainly wouldn't call Abandoned Ship perfect or anything close. I'm also aware many do find a lot of the album underwhelming, with personal least favourite cuts differing from person to person. And so the perfection of Abandoned Ship goes beyond the individual tracks and demands we take a more panoramic view of the project overall, which is what we're going to do now. So if the music itself isn't perfect, how on earth could Abandoned Ship, an artistic project consisting of music, be perfect? The inner workings may not display any of their very best work, and some cuts may be considerably less impressive than others, but on a concept-to-concept basis I'd argue it has everything one could ask for. It gives us a very good dose of classic Knife Party sound, whilst also showing them exploring completely new territory. This is important not only for creating balance for the album as a whole, but also for showing how their design can be unleashed in fresh, new, and innovative ways. All while tying directly into their pendulum past with a full vocal from Swire as well. This is what an album is for as a longer project of work, especially for a heavy bass act. Tapping into what's got you to where you are, but also showing lighter sides to your style and expanding into a more mature format. Conceptually, Abandoned Ship very much feels like an album as opposed to a mere assortment of bangers. The introduction and outro, Reconnect and Kaleidoscope are perhaps the biggest proof of this. The LP could have begun and ended with outright banger tracks, but instead they chose to tell a story, starting by saying "let us begin the story now" and ending by saying "is it the last party ever?" Within that opener and closer we get other track titles to embellish the sense of story like Resistance, Begin Again, Give It Up and Red Dawn, as well as others like EDM Trend Machine, 404 and Micro Penis to remind us of the more comical, light-hearted leanings of Knife Party. It lies somewhere in between being a concept album and one meant for bangers, experimentation and their vintage humour. What's more, the transitioning between all these tracks is seamless front to back. The relationship between all the songs is expertly crafted with no one tune feeling distinctly out of place. Regarding the main concepts, the middle 10 tracks if you will, there's also the exact right amount of them. There's no genuine feeling when I get to the end of Abandoned Ship that there should be any more or less in terms of separate concepts. It's very succinct. The range of moods their experimentation covers across the project gives it that perfect album feel too. The peaks and troughs it goes through makes for a very smooth, effortless listen. I'd also argue there's just the right amount of humour throughout, a good selection of quips and moments without ever going overboard with it. It's surprising they've always seen themselves as outsiders to the EDM scene when they so actively play their part in it and accurately make fun of it along the way. In the aforementioned 2019 Billboard interview, Swire also remarked that, "I think Knife Party's best material is when we get the balance between fucking annoying and that's pretty cool just right." The fucking annoying arrives with their constant satirical takes on the scene, some of the track concepts in themselves and how over the top their music can be, while the "that's pretty cool" comment is an acknowledgement of the fact that most of their music strikes that ideal mark between idea and production. This is all perfectly summed up across Abandoned Ship, perhaps not for all the individual tunes, but looking at the album in an overview way, it does get that balance between fucking annoying and that's pretty cool just right. Abandoned Ship may not be perfect or even fantastic front to back in terms of the precise material. It seemingly only took them 9 months to put together, which in many ways makes it even more of an incredible feat, but for others raises questions as to whether any of the production was rushed, a view that many run with that maybe don't find the LP as enjoyable. I'm also not sure they did themselves too many favours with the simplicity of the artwork considering how detailed their past ones had been. But those things aside, what the album is perfect in every way. Conceptually it has everything and ticks every box. There's variety, genre experimentation, superb production, peaks and troughs with the mood, a great opening and ending, a sense of story and progression, good length to it. And it's a super fun and enjoyable listen to go with all that. The album even provided story and intrigue beyond the music itself, with rumours of a pendulum return growing stronger and stronger at the time. Was Abandoned Ship going to be the actual Knife Party send-off? I also think this project cemented them as the best duo in bass music. Once again, the material isn't front to back perfect, but everyone can agree there are multiple fantastic tracks across it, and few in bass-driven EDM had explored the album format in such an expansive way. With Nero not being as active at that point, is there any other duo one could rank alongside Swire and McGrillen in 2014? I'm not sure. An album can be perfect without every track being amazing. The concepts and story can make up for the musical mishaps. And in the case of Abandoned Ship, the whole is very much better than the sum of its parts. Writing an album is always a very challenging process, and especially after the success they'd had up to that point, the standard they'd set. It has to be realised as well that they'd been advised not to bother writing Abandoned Ship at all, that they should simply release all their old material together on one CD. But they made that move to write 12 new cuts from scratch, and even though they weren't all on point, the project they made up turned out to reflect everything Knife Party is about. Will we see Swire and McGrillen tackle this length of project as a duo again and reach that level of greatness once more? It seems unlikely, with Pendulum very much back in full swing. I'm not sure it would matter though, as with their debut they mastered the album format. Maybe not reaching the absolute musical genius of their earliest years, but providing a perfect album listen on a conceptual and structural level, in a scene where few have, lest we forget. For those reasons and the many others I've given throughout this video, there's ample cause for thinking Knife Party's Abandoned Ship is indeed perfect.